Good morning, everyone. I hope this weather is finding you well wherever you are. Welcome to Plants, Pests, and Pathogens, what we lovingly refer to as PPP. Today, we're going to kick off the 2026 season of PPP with Principles and Practices for Preventing Pests and Plant Diseases, presented by Matt Bertone and Mike Munster. Like in past seasons, Matt and Mike will also address our BOLOs, or the timely plant pests and diseases to be on the lookout for. We're also going to hear from Charlotte Glen, who will present Plant These for Pollinators on red maple, along with some statewide Extension Master Gardener Program announcements, and that's going to get us to 11:30 a.m. You can see here a brilliant photo that Charlotte found for us of red maple blooms. And red maple is a native tree that occurs across North Carolina. It's starting to bloom now in the Piedmont. So who are our PPP team? Together, we work behind the scenes throughout the year to bring you this programming that's designed specifically for Extension Master Gardener or EMG volunteers and Extension professionals. Matt and Mike can be found at the NC State Extension Plant Disease and Insect Clinic. Matt is the clinic director and an entomologist, and Mike is our trusted plant disease diagnostician. Charlotte Glen is the program manager of the NC State Extension Master Gardener Program, and I'm Ariyah April. I serve as the program assistant under Charlotte. So a little about PPP before we dive in today. We meet here online the fourth Tuesday at 10 a.m. from February through October. PPP is almost an unbeatable way to earn your continuing ed hours as an EMG volunteer. So like today, you will earn 1.5 hours of continuing ed by attending or even watching the recording of PPP webinars. So these hours, of course, count toward your annual EMG certification requirements to stay in good standing as an extension volunteer. Since it's the start of the season, we thought we'd remind you of some of the best websites to help when you're trying to diagnose a plant problem. We're going to include these links in the resource document that we generally email out within a week of each live webinar. So if there's a link or a reference mentioned during any of our PPP episodes like today, do not worry, we are going to put all of those links in the resource document so they are right at your fingertips when you need them. About this year's PPP schedule, you can see here that we have another exciting and educational season lined up for you. Matt Bertone and Mike Munster are going to be our featured speakers in the months you see here on these topics. And you can see more about every PPP episode at the website go.ncsu.edu/PPP-schedule. On alternating months of the season, we're going to have guests who will address a broad variety of topics related to sustainable gardening. So along with seeing more about the episodes at this URL, you can find every PPP episode on the intranet calendar. That's where you register for specific episodes like you did today. So where does PPP live on the EMG intranet? Right here, you can see after you log in to the intranet, a little ways down on the left-hand column, the PPP webpage, if you click on that. And on this webpage, you can find our schedule. You can register for PPP webinars, and of course, you can find recordings and the resource documents for past webinars. Friendly reminder that you can find past PPP recordings on YouTube. We have a YouTube playlist. You can see it if you go to go.ncsu.edu/PPP-playlist. And we will include these URLs in the resource document for today so that you have them at your fingertips. I'll pause now to say a big thank you to our PPP subtitle editor volunteer team. It's important that all of our subtitles for these episodes are correct so that our content is accessible to anyone who is watching it. And we had a tremendous backlog of PPP and other continuing ed webinars to make accessible through subtitle editing. And more than 24 EMG volunteers have over the years helped us get through this backlog. And we thank you all so, so much. These EMG volunteers have been working hard to help make these episodes ready for public consumption on YouTube. Now on to our program. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'll kick it over to Matt Bertone.
Good morning, everyone. Actually, I think we are going to start with Mike. Mike is going to start us off with this session.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I don't know how it is where you are, but it's a little chilly here this morning. I like the cold weather, but I also am itching to get some seeds planted here and get the gardening season going for the year. And this time, since it is the first session of the year, I do want to start out with a poll. So if you could let us know, just out of curiosity and for our benefit, how long you have been an Extension Master Gardener volunteer. We had someone at a tour was yesterday, Matt, who had been, I think, 24 years, something like that, Master Gardener volunteer. So that's pretty impressive. And we like to know this in part because it helps us kind of set a time frame or sliding frame, how long we should wait before we start repeating ourselves too much, although we haven't been doing that much lately. But let's see, let's go ahead and end it now and share the results. So yes, it looks like the mode is that 1 to 5 year time slot. We got 7 people who are over 20 years. So that's wonderful. And 31 new folks here, just less than a year. So welcome aboard to you. Thank you for your persistence for those who have been here longer. And we hope this will be a good session for you, whether you are new or returning. Usually I should say usually, sometimes we talk about things very granular, such as diseases and pests on hydrangeas. But this time we're going to take the kind of 30,000-foot view and look at some principles. And the title that we have here, Principles and Practices of Preventing Plant Pests and Pathogens. It really should be called Principles and Practices of Preventing Damage by Plant Pests and Pathogens, but that would ruin the alliteration. So we're going to go with this title here. And we did this talk for the Union County group about 1.5 years ago. And when they did the publicity, they didn't ask about this, but they put out some publicity that had a very interesting question I think is worth starting with. It's, have you ever seen 2 plants side by side? One was diseased and one wasn't, and wondered what caused that? And let me just show you an example of this. These 2 Indian hawthorns here on campus, on main campus by the Marianne Fox building, one at each end, one heavily infested with Entomosporium leaf spot and the other very clean. So what might explain this difference? And just kind of think about that as we go through and talk about our principles here. And we're going to start with principle number 1, which is that you want to correctly identify the pest, pathogen, or other cause before you make any plans of taking measures against them. So it seems like, well, is that really prevention? But bear with us for a moment about the importance of this.
So,
all right, let's see. Okay, for now, there they go. So correctly identifying the problem is our first step. And always keep in mind that very often it's actually not a pest or pathogen. Very often it's some kind of a cultural or environmental problem. So environmental problems are very commonly the cause of our plant problems. Temperature being too warm, too cold, insufficient water, excess water, nutrient deficiency or excess, hail, wind, other forces of nature. But very, very often it's the Homo sapiens species that is the worst offender in our plant problems with misapplied chemicals, improper planting, and so forth. But do remember that most organisms that you see out in the garden, in the landscape, are not causing any harm or damage. And I like the analogy that our turf pathologist taught me years ago to say, am I looking at a lion or am I looking at a buzzard? So You may have heard me say before, if you're driving down the road and you see buzzards at a carcass, you would say, oh, poor deer, the buzzards killed it. No, something else killed it and the buzzards came later. And the same thing applies with microorganisms. Some are capable of attacking healthy plant tissue, and others need the dead or in some way damaged plant tissue to be able to use it as a substrate. Likewise with our arthropod pests, insects and mites. Some of them are primary and some of them are secondary. So just because you see it, don't assume it. What you're looking at may be a lion, a buzzard, it may even be a friend, some beneficial.
Yeah, and just like Mike was saying, that some are kind of there to cause harm or not, definitely be aware of innocent bystanders. So just because something, a critter is on a plant, doesn't mean it's harming it or doing anything to it. So these little click beetles are hanging out on this plant, probably eating some pollen and whatnot, or just resting and looking for mates, things like that. And so just because it's there, even if there's abundance of them, like these three, I would say definitely figure out what they are first, and then, don't shoot first, ask questions later kind of thing, because these could be completely harmless or even beneficials. And so killing them is not good. Like one a good example are bark lice. So if you see these little insects on bark, or they're commonly found on thick evergreen leaves of things like hollies and camellias, you might think, oh man, this thing is infesting my plant because they're so abundant. Well, they're just resting on the surface. They're feeding on spores and lichens and algae and all that stuff. In fact, cleaning the plants a little bit, and are completely harmless to the plants. So just because you see something in abundance on a plant does not mean that it is harmful. So take a breath, try and figure out what the idea is, and when in doubt, ask us. Another group of insects that you might find on plants commonly are plant hoppers. These may be present. They might be creating wax, like that bottom photo, this kind of wax substance that they produce to help protect them. It might seem worrisome or look like a fungus or something like that, or they might even be very common on the plants. But again, they're not going to really harm the plants. They're not of concern, and you could be spraying chemicals for no reason, just because, again, these things are present.
And let's take an example from the fungal world here. So you see a mushroom coming up in your yard, and I'm going to ask the question, how should you feel about that? Should you be worried about your trees? Should you be unconcerned for them? Should you be happy for them? Or should you be confused about the situation? So let me just relaunch this poll and let us know what you think. This particular one, we're going to get at a general principle here, but it's a little bit tricky because it's a specific fungus genus here that we're looking at that will determine the answer. Give folks another 3 or 4 seconds. Really good response rate today. I see that over 200 folks have already put in their thoughts on this, and we'll go ahead and end it now and share those results. So very few said that they would be worried about their trees. Most said unconcerned. Quite a few said happy for your trees, and D, were confused. Well, it turns out that this particular picture is of a rustula, and rustulas are mycorrhizal. So they would be forming a positive in terms of the tree, and excuse me, mycorrhizal relationship with the roots. This is just their fruity body that comes up and produces the spores in order to reproduce. So this in this particular case, the answer is that you should be happy for your trees if you see rustulas in your yard. Right. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't share those results. There they are. Here's another example. If you have Death's armillaria or armillaria coming up in a landscape bed around trees or shrubs versus a leucocaprinus coming up in a landscape bed or perhaps in a flower pot even, know that the armillaria is going to be a potential pathogen. affecting living cambium in trees and shrubs, whereas the Leucocoprinus, the yellow parasol mushroom, is just a saprobe decaying the organic matter. I had this question yesterday at a talk. What about stinkhorns? Stinkhorns are also going to be saprobes, so breaking down that dead organic matter and not plant pathogens.
And one thing to note is that many plants and other organisms have co-evolved. So, like Mike mentioned, the russula and the trees have co-evolved to be with each other. They're more of a mutualism. These are insects like this Yopon holly and this native psyllid, the Yopon psyllid. The insect does cause some damage to the plant, but it's a native species on a native plant. And so they've evolved for millennia or even millions of years together. And so they could typically tolerate, it's not going to kill the plants outright. They're in an arms race oftentimes because the insect wants to feed on the plant and the plant doesn't necessarily want to be fed on. But this isn't something that you need to say, oh, this is drastic. This is going to wipe out all my hollies and whatnot. So it's more, can you tolerate it? Because the plant and the insect have been here long before humans were here. And on the converse side, invasive pests are often more damaging. So crepe myrtle bark scale has been in the US now for almost a decade, I would say, or more than a decade. And basically, it is now fairly common on crepe myrtles. Before the pest was here, the crepe myrtles were pretty safe from things except for crepe myrtle aphids, which are also non-native. But since this arrived, and there's not a lot of pressure on them from pests and parasites, and you can see even fire ants, which are also invasive in the lower left-hand corner, tending to these insects, these become very problematic and basically overwhelm the plants. And this is the same for things like spotted lanternfly that you hear a lot about because there's not a lot of natural enemies. There's not a lot of pathogens keeping them down. Their populations are booming. And so it becomes a very severe problem.
Moving on now to principle number 2. This one is going to be titled Pick Your Battles. And that is to say that some things cause more damage than others, even those that are pests and pathogens. Among diseases, not all is equal. And I use this graphic to illustrate that on the least serious end would be things like leaf spots and powdery mildews, especially if those leaf spots are on a deciduous tree, because it can tolerate a certain amount of loss of that photosynthetic area, and those leaves are going to be shed at the end of the season anyway. Could be a little bit more problematic on our evergreens, and there are some exceptions. Of course, boxwood blight is essentially a leaf pathogen and twig, but it causes a lot of damage. But in general, it's the leaf spots and powdery mildews are going to be the ones that we would least worry about. The cankers, where you're losing individual branches, or if it's down at the base, you could lose the entire upper portion of the tree or shrub. That would be more serious, whereas root rots and then vascular wilts would be more serious, that can take out the entire plant. A couple of examples of things that might be dramatic and eye-catching but are actually not problematic would be slime flux on the left, which is the result of an internal condition called wet wood, where the sap is being fermented by microorganisms and builds up pressure. The gases that are produced there that force out this frothy, fermented smelling liquid through cracks or wounds on the bark, very often on white oaks, very often very low to the ground. This may attract different insects, butterflies, wasps, beetles, and flies, but it's actually not a pathogenic situation. A tree may flux one year and not another. So if this is the only thing going on, then there's really not anything to worry about with your tree. Another example, oak leaf blister, which starts out in the spring as these sort of puckered light green areas on the leaves, but then about June in our area, they start to turn brown, go necrotic. The fungus has already completed its life cycle. So there's really, even if you were to take action, it wouldn't be the appropriate moment, but it seems like it's spreading that time of year just because the blisters are now drying out. And in any case, it's a cosmetic problem on our oaks, not anything to worry about.
And the same is true for arthropods. Basically, very similar principles. Leaf feeders, especially on deciduous trees, especially native ones like oak worms and things like that, that are going to feed on some of the leaves. that are especially late in the season when the plant's done a lot of its growing and lots of energy production, they will lose those leaves and then grow them again. And if they're native pests, they're going to be, it's kind of like this cycle that they're in. But then, just like the diseases, anything that's affecting the roots or boring into the stem or girdling it, anything like that is going to attack kind of the lifeline of the plant. And so they will become more serious, those types of pests. So also note that pests may have broad or narrow host range. So things like the Japanese beetle feed on over 275 plant species in numerous families, whereas the tulip poplar weevil, really you only going to see damage on things like tulip poplar, liriodendron, and magnolia, which are two very closely related trees. And so knowing the host range can know whether you might other plants in your yard might be susceptible to these, or if you really just are focusing on one plant, and then knowing how much damage they might cause overall.
The converse of that we'll see too later, of how we exploit the use of plants that are not going to be affected by certain things. Principle number 3, though, before we get there is, and you've heard this before, grow plants that are adapted to your soil, to your climate, and maybe any particular site limitations that you have, let's say shallow soils or air pollution in a city and so forth. You have a great resource. We have a great resource in the North Carolina Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox, where you can look up things and see what kind of soil conditions they like, how much sun do they need, how much shade can they tolerate, what hardiness zone they are from, or will be adapted to. A lot of very helpful information here in the toolbox to try and choose the right plant for the right place.
And a really good principle is that arthropods can be symptoms of plant stress. And this is also similar with diseases, but plants naturally defend themselves against arthropods. So they produce chemicals, they produce things like that. But if they are paying more attention to surviving from other stresses, they can't do that as well. And so you get more insects on plants that are stressed out. And so, in fact, they found that, for instance, here's gloomy scales on maples, those in hot areas, it's planted in cities and parking lots, places like that where there's a lot of drought, there's not a lot of access to water. There's the heat island effect from all the pavement and impervious surfaces. The plants actually produce more nitrogen, which is more nutritious to the insects, and those heat effects can affect their natural enemies more. And so this can actually have a cascading effect. And oftentimes when we find pests on a plant that typically don't have pests, we suspect that there's some other stressor happening that's causing them to be more susceptible to the pests. And to further this is a very common thing that I really like to hit home for the master gardeners, is that bark ambrosia and other wood boring beetles may seem like they are coming in and attacking the plants, killing them. It's easy to see the signs of them. It's easy to see these actual larvae when you peel apart bark or things like that, or you see these frass toothpicks in the lower right hand side on these trees coming out from ambrosia beetles boring into them. But in most cases, these are just early invaders of these dying and stressed plants. They are taking advantage of the sickness of the plant or the decline of the plant to be able to colonize it more easily. Again, they're not going to deal with the chemicals and these other things that are usually deterring them, and they want to eat that dead wood or grow their fungus, in the case of ambrosia beetles, in that dead and dying wood. Now, there are some cases of primary borers like Asian longhorn beetle that attacks healthy maples, or red bay ambrosia beetle attacking some members of the Lauraceae that are healthy. But in those cases, we know specifically, we're going to look specifically for that species and that to see whether it was a primary pest. But in most cases, I would say the majority of cases, when you see beetles boring into plants, it is because they are not happy and they're stressed and declining.
And when I mention this in talks and Matt's not present, I always say, and if you have a problem with that, then you have to take it up with Matt, who's a big guy. Moving on to principle number 4, know your damage and possible culprits. And we're going to start out with some things in the area of arthropod pests.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a lot about arthropods. So arthropods are insects and other invertebrates in the phylum Arthropoda. They have a exoskeleton, the body divided up and have appendages that are jointed and segmented. These include arachnids such as mites and spiders, myriapods such as centipedes and millipedes, and the insects, of course, and some other groups. And this is the most common diverse group of animals you encounter, basically, and are very important then for gardens and whatnot. So insects have typically 6 legs, antennae, and as adults have 4 wings, although they vary greatly. And then mites are a type of arachnid, so they have no wings or antennae, typically 8 legs as adults. But both groups are super diverse, and some are pests, others are beneficial, and many are just kind of neutral and just out there living their lives. So all have a life cycle and not all stages are pests. So it's really important to know that. So arthropods develop gradually or through stages. So some go from an egg to a nymph to an adult, and the nymph is very similar to the adult. Maybe it lacks wings and reproductive organs. It typically feeds on a similar thing to the adult. Whereas things that undergo complete metamorphosis, egg, larva, pupa, and adult, like a caterpillar here to a moth, this is actually a strategy for the larvae to feed on something different than the adults, or the adults don't feed at all and drain all their nutrition being a larva. Some do this multiple times per year, while others only once or twice a year. And knowing which type, you may know how often these things are going to be at this stage during the year. And this can help with timing and whether management is necessary. It might be too late, for instance, because they've done their feeding for the year, and so there's no point in even scouting or whatnot. But it's very important to know the development of each type of pest and arthropods in general. Also, scouting. Insects are mobile. Many insects are mobile. They're not like diseases where if they're going to be on the plant, they're not going to be flying around or whatever. So scouting is really important. Some are hidden, like this caterpillar and that's tied these redbud leaves together. You can see only when you shine the light through that little caterpillar in the center. And it can be a game of hide and seek. These leaf hoppers are sitting under a leaf. So always look on the underside of leaves. In fact, this is a good principle for pathogens as well. But insects like to hide under leaves. It hides them from the sun, from predators, things like that. Also scout at different times of day and night. Some things are only active at dusk or dawn or at night. And so you may see damage during the day, but that's when we're active. So it's good to go out with a flashlight, look around for these insects at night, and that can actually reveal what you have. And then just going over some types of damage from arthropods. So defoliation, and these are ways to describe these types of damage too. Defoliation is damage that completely or mostly strips the leaves or needles off a plant. And this is often caused by caterpillars, beetles, or sawflies, shown here actually. In top right, caterpillar, bottom left, beetle, and bottom right, some pine sawflies. Skeletonizing is where insects feed in between the leaf veins, sometimes feeding all the way through, making it skeletonized, or creating this window painting effect where you get just a bit of the epidermis still left over. This is often caused by beetles, sawflies, and caterpillars, depending on the size and the species. Leaf mining is when arthropods live in between the upper and lower surface of the leaves, and this is basically almost always larvae, as far as I know, always larvae. And they can be linear, serpentine, or blotch-like. So in the bottom left, you see a blotch-like one, and then in the bottom right, you see that serpentine one. And this is caused by flies, caterpillars, or beetles, depending on the species and the host. Galls are tumor-like growths in plant tissue, usually stems and leaves, and is caused by an organism. And there's lots of other organisms other than arthropods that cause galls, but in the arthropods, it's mostly flies, bugs like aphids and whatnot, mites or wasps. And here you see some various galls created by different types of insects.
Yeah, I was going to chime in there too. Glad you did already, Matt, that some galls are produced by fungi, some are produced by bacteria, some are produced by nematodes. So really the gamut of possibilities is pretty wide when you see a gall.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Wood boring. These are feeding and tunneling in tissue or under bark, usually in wood, but sometimes in herbaceous plants. This is often caused by beetles, sawflies, or caterpillars. Kind of in that order, I would say. And then distortion, malformation. This is where the plant growth is of abnormal size and or shape and texture. This is often caused by mites, bugs, or thrips. But note that there are other things that can cause this, like pathogens like viruses, as well as herbicides, which can cause the plants to grow distorted and malformed. And I think finally, discoloration. Oh no, I think I have one more after this. Discoloration. So this is just abnormal discoloration color of the plants, and this is often caused by bugs and mites. Although the bottom right one is thrips, which cause silvering damage on that viburnum leaf. And then I think finally is the flagging and branch damage. This is physical damage to twigs on the trees and bushes, and may cause them to break or hang. This is sometimes from feeding, but also oftentimes from egg laying or on purpose. Like on the bottom right, that longhorn beetle actually girdles twigs to kill them in order to lay its eggs in there. In fact, showing that it requires dead or dying tissue to survive. And then cicadas are famous for laying eggs in the other photos that cause flagging in the trees.
And I should add that there are canker diseases that will cause flagging as well, and things like the fire blight. So quite a number of possibilities there as well. And just to kind of elevate to the level of a principle, what Matt said earlier about scouting. So get out on the range, be looking at different times of day if it's critters that you're suspecting, and catch things early. So on the right here, this is a rose bush that went too long. It should have been eliminated with the first indication of rose rosette virus, which would be abnormal elongation of the new shoots, retention of that juvenile red color instead of turning green, so that you didn't get to the stage here of having witches' brooms and a lot of deformation, and then therefore more buildup of the population of the Ariyah mites that transmit the virus. On the left, you wouldn't know it just from the picture, but that's septoria leaf spot on tomatoes. So be aware of that as you're, growing your tomatoes and when it's going to be appearing. So just kind of paying attention, be scouting. Principle number 6, it takes 3 to tango. So you may have heard a saying indicating another number here as far as requirement for tangoing, but if you think about it, 2 dancers, if they didn't have music, would just stand there or walk away. So we like to talk about in plant pathology what's called the disease triangle. In order to have disease, you have to have a combination of all 3 of these. A competent pathogen, some kind of disease-causing microorganism. You have to have a susceptible host plant. And this is the music. You've got to have favorable environmental conditions for that interaction to take place. Also, it needs to have a certain amount of time for that to develop. So we would differentiate between disease, for example, and damage that occurred in a very short period of time overnight due to arthropod feeding, vertebrate feeding, lightning damage, anything that happens that doesn't need that time element to allow the interaction to develop between the pathogen and the host. And the pathogens, you've already studied your manual, and you know that the 4 big groups of plant pathogens are the fungi, bacteria, nematodes, and viruses. We won't go into depth on those, just to remind you that fungi are the ones that get the blue ribbon. That's why it's in blue. And they also get the asterisk because there are some very important ones that technically are not true fungi. They're not related to fungi, but they ecologically behave like them and also grow in a similar way and reproduce by spores and so on. But all 4 of these would represent our biggest categories of plant pathogens. Within that disease triangle, then, I'm going to break out 6 sub-principles, A, B, and C, but all designated by the letter E. So this is the triple E principle. And the first one is looking at the pathogen corner of the triangle. Try and exclude that pathogen if you can, or if it's already present, reduce the what we call initial inoculum, how much there is of it to start the growing season. An example of exclusion would be taking care of what you're putting into your garden. So anytime you move soil and anytime you move live plants or plant parts, you could be moving pathogens. They look a little rough, but you wouldn't necessarily know that those Liriope bibs on the left are infested with root knot nematodes. I believe they also had some other problems with them when they were sent in as a sample, but that was planting material that a grower was concerned about and sent in, and we found this problem. Fig I'd like to use as an example of the transmission of viruses by propagation. So back when I lived in Aguascalientes in Mexico, one of the other folks at the university would have a class on plant propagation for homeowners, and one of their projects was to do air layering of the fig trees there on campus. And so these folks would go home happily with their little fig trees, but they were also taking their fig mosaic virus with them because it is systemic in the plant and is transmitted with vegetative propagation. So thinking about these things will help you to possibly exclude, by not bringing into your system, any kind of pathogens that aren't there already. But then we have to think about, how do the ones that are present, the pathogens that are present, survive during the hard times, which may be winter, maybe a dry period, or a period when there's no host plant actively growing. And there are basically three strategies here that we want to think about that'll help us prevent their damage. One is that they may survive adversity on living host plants. Could be in weeds growing around the border of the garden or landscape. So that's a way that our tomato spotted wilt virus will pass the winter, and then the thrips move it from there into the garden once the season changes. Or some pathogens survive on buds or cankers on woody plants. Fire blight would be an example there. A second way is that they may survive as resting structures in the soil. It could be resting spores, sclerotia. You can see here some examples: sclerotia, Sclerotium rolfsii. These hardened structures. Sclerotinia produces some that look like mouse droppings, kind of more irregular and dark. Or in the case of nematodes, as eggs in the soil. So different ways that they can survive in the soil in a resting state. And the third possibility is on dead plant material. So either residue in the garden or even in the compost pile, because they don't tend to get hot enough. You can have your pathogens surviving. Those that are able to survive in dead material can bridge the gap that way. So this leads to the idea that, well, pruning then is a good strategy for canker diseases, because we can get the season off to a start with less of the bacteria, less of the fungus present if we prune it out. You just have to be a little bit careful that you go far enough into the clean tissue to get the pathogen eliminated, and also be cleaning your tools frequently during the process. This is actually not data, it's just illustrative of the idea that some pathogens are only soil invaders and will disappear quickly. That's the red line, after a few years without a host plant. And the soil inhabitants will only diminish their population slowly, if at all. So the idea here is that it's the soil invaders that we're going to have the possibility of using a rotation to try and prevent them or prevent their damage. So something like bacterial leaf spot on tomatoes and peppers, right? That won't survive very long once the plant material has decomposed, versus something like southern bacterial wilt, which will be in the soil in perpetuity. And let me just pop up another poll here. That will, oop, too late. I clicked and I didn't get a chance to get the poll up again, but there you go. So
Awesome.
the better of these three rotations is obviously the one that has three different families in 3 different years. In the first, you've got the same things every year. Oh, there it came. Now the control panel came up, so I could have launched the poll. The second one, you may be rotating, but you're rotating within the same family. Likewise, D is all within the same family. So you want to do different families. Here's a nice table that was in the Southeast U.S. Vegetable Crop Handbook, may still be in the current version, where you've got a nice breakdown of the families and examples in them to help you plan your rotation. And some pathogens don't survive here at all. So the winter, it's too cold for our cucurbit downy mildew to overwinter. And so it has to do that in places like Florida. And we're always on the lookout for it each year for its arrival sometime between late May and mid-June in North Carolina. And they put an alert when that happens. So it can come up on wind currents, but it can also come up on transplants. So you want to be careful there with your transplants too. And just another thing to point out when we're learning about any particular disease, you want to ask, well, how does it spread? So on the left here, you've got some spores produced in a little droplet of liquid. So that one would be spread either by water splash or possibly insects. Whereas the powdery mildew chain of conidia of spores there on the right, that one is going to be dry and air dispersed. Wind, water, and insect or mite vectors being the three things that we often think about for those factors that forces that disseminate our pathogens, but also keep in mind people, tools, vehicles can do the job as well. So moving on to our second sub-principle under the disease triangle, the second E, exploit host immunity and resistance. Now, will this screen let me see the controls? Yes. All right. Let's go ahead and launch an A through D poll or A through E poll. And what do you think about these statements here? Which one is true? Is it that immunity to pathogens is common among plants? That it's consistent across all plants in a family? That resistance provides greater protection than immunity? That resistance varies among plant species, but not within plant species, or that resistance to one pathogen implies resistance to others. There's a lot to think about there. So we'll give you a few moments to contemplate that as you look at that nice photograph, micrograph of the spore-bearing structure of Nucladium, or now it's Calinectria pseudonaviculata, the fungus that causes boxwood blight. So which of these statements sounds right as far as plant immunity and resistance to pathogens? So 100 and almost 50 brave individuals have chimed in. You should be able to see a place to click on your response there on the screen. I'm not sure how this looks on mobile devices though. But either way, there should be a way of answering there, and we can register your anonymous contribution and share the aggregate results. So let's do that in about another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So interesting. Okay. So happily, the lowest number of respondents chose E, because we do want to be aware that just because your, let's say, rose is resistant to black spot doesn't mean it's going to be resistant to, let's say, powdery mildew. Resistance varying among, but not within plant species. A lot of folks chose that, but maybe it was confusing the way it was worded, but actually this is false, because that is often what we use to try to address a disease problem, is finding varieties within a species that are less susceptible than others, or we could say resistant. Resistance provides greater protection than immunity. Well, immunity would be complete exclusion of disease, so that's not it. Consistent across all plants in a family. Well, there is some consistency, but not 100%. So not all rosaceous plants get the fire blight, for example. So I guess that leaves with A, immunity to pathogens is common among plants. And that is true. So that gets back to the idea that Matt was talking about as well, that there are a lot of organisms out there that are not causing harm. So plants are able to coexist with, not be affected by a great number of microorganisms out in the environment. So pathogens, and this is the what's the word I want? The other side of what Matt was talking about with insects, right? When he talked about Japanese beetles versus the weevil there. Root knot nematodes, example of a plant pathogen that has a very wide host range. And so if you've got it in your landscape bed, as these hydrangeas had, then you're going to have to look hard to find there are a few things that will either resist or tolerate its presence, but it's going to be a harder job than finding something that doesn't get black spot, which only gets on roses. And again, diseases do tend to run in families. So that's something we can use as a first pass when we're not sure, but it's not going to be 100%. So stone fruits would not get fire blight. If you think you have it on your peaches, it's something else. And here's the photo that we led off with the teaser of why one Indian hawthorn got Entomosporium leaf spot and the other didn't. And originally I thought maybe it was the microclimate, one corner of the building versus another, drier, shadier. But then I saw them in bloom and I realized, no, they're different varieties. So this is a case where if you're going to be putting in Indian hawthorn and you don't want to have the spots on them, so you're not a plant pathologist, for example, and you're not interested in those spots, then choose one of the cultivars that is less susceptible. And there's a corollary to this principle of exploiting the immunity and resistance, and that is diversify. So a saying that someone came up with many years ago at a meeting at Krosnar was symmetry leads to cemetery. But we'd like to do that, right? We like a nice symmetrical hedge or screen, all of the same species, but then you could be setting yourself up for something like this, which was the Passiflora leaf, or sorry, Passiflora needle blight on these Leyland cypress. Moving on to our third principle based on the disease triangle, the third E, encourage. Encourage conditions that favor the plant and not the pathogen. So that involves everything from the site selection and preparation, things like watching your drainage patterns. In this bed here, the reason those hellebores are doing poorly on the left is probably because that is where it is lower and it's wetter, and hellebore doesn't like wet feet. Using raised beds to try and help prevent problems with Phytophthora and Pythium. Incorporation of organic matter in the soil. And crop rotation in the vegetable garden we already mentioned, as well as aeration and turf is an important practice. So all these things that you can do to try and make the environment more favorable for the particular plant and less favorable for the organism. So these organisms vary. Some, like Scrollicium ralphsii, southern stem blight, they like hot temperatures. We're not going to see those until at least May. Whereas the cool season is great for things like sclerotinia, aka white mold, and botrytis. But often the disease is most severe when the temperature gives the advantage to the pathogen. So planting your pansies too early in the fall, while the weather is still warm, is going to give them a disadvantage, put them at a disadvantage and give a leg up to some of their pathogens. Moisture, on the other hand, is pretty much a universal requirement for some of our pathogens. I shouldn't say universal, because viruses wouldn't need it, but free water from rain, dew, irrigation is often needed for infection by fungi and bacteria. And the oomycetes in particular, Pythium and Phytophthora, love that excess water. Although powdery mildews, a true fungus, they can get by with just high humidity. Here are a couple of examples of the beneficial effect of moisture, but for the pathogen. So the Acidovorax bacterial leaf blight there on the cannas, and there were several things, including I think it was Pythium Phytophthora and something else on that Dusty Miller there. So plants seldom drown from excess water, but that excess water can favor their pathogens. And speaking of that, then why or how can we manage our water to best prevent disease? Well, plant and raised beds again, avoid overwatering and overhead irrigation if you can, water when the foliage will dry quickly. And then this last concept here, which I picked up from Mark Wyndham, who used to be out at Tennessee, graduate of here, don't extend the overnight nighttime wetness period. So if the leaves are wet from dew starting at 4 in the morning and going to 8, well, don't water at 7:30 and then make that a 3 or 4 hour wet period instead of a 2.5 hour wet period, because you just give more time for, let's say, those spores to germinate and the fungus to infect. Another case of conditions that you want to try and either avoid or ameliorate. Here, the Phytophthora was worse on what looks like the low spot in the landscape. So that's just something to be aware of as well in our gardens. And my last thought here, and we don't really talk much about pesticides in plants, pests, and pathogens because we know that you don't make recommendations on those to your clients. But the question I think is important to ask: can pesticides ever be considered a preventive measure? And here is a list, or excuse me, a kind of a grid of some diseases that it might be worthwhile to actually use sprays against them. But the question is, when would you do that preventively, sort of sight unseen? And there are a couple of cases where that would be justified. For example, if you want to grow fruits, tree fruits in North Carolina, you're going to either need a high tolerance for insect damage and pathogen losses, or you're going to need to have a spray program from the beginning. Another example where it might be warranted would be where you have a really susceptible kind of either, let's say, a susceptible cultivar of rose to black spot, and you don't want to have the leaves dropping off severely, or something like if you're still trying to grow hollyhock, a wonderful plant, but discouraging because of how much rust it gets. So there may be a few cases where that would be a justified and considered a preventive measure. Although in some sense they're all preventive anyway, because no spray is going to make those spots go back green or regrow a leaf that's been chewed off. So you're trying to protect the new growth and existing growth. And sometimes, of course, it is inevitable that you will have, no matter what your attempts are, you will have disease. Example here, powdery mildew on euonymus. And I have not been paying any attention to the time, so I apologize for that if we've gone late. But no, we're actually doing pretty good here.
All right. Well, Mike, if you want to take a look in the chat, there are some questions you might be able to address. I've been trying to type some responses, but otherwise, if people are ready, we will start with the arthropod bolos, and then Mike will mention some disease bolos, and then we'll move it over to Charlotte. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, let's talk about some be on the lookouts for arthropods. And this will be for March, late February, March or so until our next session. And the first thing is going to be ground nesting bees. A lot of the native ground nesting bees are going to be emerging. They've been underground, developing as larvae over the last year. They're going to be developing into the adults this spring. They're going to dig their way out. They're going to mate. The females are going to start collecting pollen, and they're going to feed on nectar. And then often in these bare patches of ground where they emerge, they may re-nest, and you may have kind of a little kind of cityscape of little bees in your lawn. So don't worry, the activity is usually only for a few weeks. They are not aggressive, or they don't sting very often. I laid in this pile of them, and they just waited patiently for me to take my photos and leave. But they're very good pollinators. They're native bees, and so be on the lookout for them, and maybe count yourself lucky if you have this kind of population in your yard. Fall cankerworms, we haven't had many years where they've been super serious, but they do come out in this, they do start to hatch in the spring. The eggs were laid by females over the winter after mating with the males. And these little tiny green inchworms will drop all over the place, and in heavy infestations can defoliate the new foliage that is coming out of the trees as they start to grow. You can identify the fall cankerworm by these little tiny stubby prolegs that they have. They have two pairs of well-developed ones, and then those little stubby ones where the arrows are pointing. But again, we haven't seen many years where they've been super bad recently, but it can change year to year. You might have some species of termites swarming. If you see termites swarming in your yard, just know that they are part of our natural ecosystem out there. They are actually decomposers and really important to break down wood, to return nutrients to the soil, whatnot. If they are emerging next to your house or in your house, it might be good to actually call a professional to take a look and see if you have an infestation there. A lot of other things are going to be waking up as well after it starts to warm up. You're going to start to see paper wasps, hornets, and yellow jacket queens waking up from the winter where they've been hibernating. They were mated in the fall, and then they're going to start making their first nest themselves. As the nest grows bigger, as they have their daughters start to develop and emerge, those daughters are going to take over a lot of the work, and the colonies will begin to grow bigger. And just like that, there's a lot of other things that are waking up. You might have ladybugs and stuff, whatnot, but a lot of the larger bugs overwinter as adults too. So stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs, you may think, where do they come from? How do they develop so quickly? It's because they've been kind of waiting around over the winter to become active again, start feeding and mating and laying their eggs for the new generation this year. So we've got the stink bug in the upper right, the brown marmorated stink bug, and a large leaf-footed bug, which is basically this genus right there is pretty harmless to plants, but they are very large and can be kind of alarming looking. But anyway, they are harmless. So I did want to also focus on a couple other things to be on the lookout for. The first is the yellow-legged hornet. So again, as with other hornets and yellow jackets, the queens will be waking up. This is native to Southeast Asia and first found in Georgia near Savannah in 2023. They did recently find a nest in South Carolina outside of Charlotte, North Carolina in York County. So we are on the lookout because it is an invasive wasp. It is probably going to be established by now, but I guess there's still some chance of it being eradicated, but I'm not so sure. And this wasp isn't much larger than some of our native ones, but they do make an embryo nest before making another larger nest around it. That's called the primary nest, the next one. And then they create a large secondary nest separate from that, which can get up to 400 to 2,000 workers later on in the year. And we're really worried about them because they're one of the bee destroying species that preferentially likes to hunt flying insects near flowers and hives. And so we're going to be on the lookout for that in North Carolina. Just to show you an example, the embryo nest is this small kind of round one that is often built in under the eaves of homes, and then the primary nest is built on top of that, and then they will go fly off and make a much larger secondary nest up in trees. Looks a lot similar to our native bald-faced hornets, but I think it's a little bit more brown typically than the gray that they produce. And just to show you some sizes, so this is taken from a NCDA fact sheet that we worked on together, but you can see the yellow-legged hornet is about the same size as the queen southern yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets. It's a bit smaller than European hornets and cicada killers. And just to give you some more specifics, the tip of the abdomen is yellow, but most of the body is dark except for the pale legs, the pale feet, giving its common name the yellow-legged hornet. And you can see over to the left, these are the counties where they are now confirmed. So be on lookout for them. Please report them to NCDA or to us if you find them. And unfortunately, I think it's out of the bag. And finally, be on the lookout for box tree moth. So box tree moth is a moth that was first found in Canada a few years ago. It has been making its way down into New York. I think it's in Ohio, maybe even into Kentucky, areas like that. So this is the only caterpillar really that will feed on boxwoods. They are green caterpillars with black markings and a dark black head, and the adults look like this. They're these moths with this kind of gray outline and a white base color. So anyway, be on the lookout for them. We do not have them yet, but they are going to be a hugely serious pest of boxwoods when they do make it down here. And I do mean when they make it down here, because they will be here. All right, Mike. Well, I'm going to stop and let you talk about some diseases.
Thank you, Matt. I would like to address one of the questions from the chat, actually verbally between the two of us. The others I answered in the chat, but the question was, overall, do native plants have less PP and P than non-natives? And so that is not necessarily true. They just happen to have less damage from those pests and pathogens that are native and that they have co-evolved with. So you may get an invasive non-native that could cause a lot of damage on a native plant, more than it would cause on the non-natives that were brought in. So the example, maybe this isn't quite the perfect example, but we unfortunately gave the pine wilt nematode to Asia. So it's a terrible problem in Japan. Their conifers did not evolve with this pathogen and they had severe losses. Whereas if you plant native, something like a loblolly, since that is a native tree to our area as well as the pathogen, so then it may be infested to a certain degree, but you don't really have any damage. Plant a Japanese black pine though, and you're going to have a real risk of losing it to the pine wood nematode. So it kind of depends on really the combination of the native status of the pest and of the pathogen, as well as how much, if it's a non-native pest or pathogen, how much, well, say the pests, how much the natural enemies have either followed it or adapted to it and so forth. And Matt can probably speak to that better than I.
Yeah, I mean, it's something you can't really make a blanket statement about. There are definitely plenty of native plants. There's native oaks, for instance, have hundreds of species, it seems like that on them. I always tell this to people, you can grab a twig of an oak with like a half a dozen leaves and you can find 10 to 12, maybe more types of insect damage or growth on them. So they're an ecosystem for these insects. Now, whether it's a pest or not, to the oak, it's not really that much of a pest. But if you like perfect leaves on your oak, then maybe it's a pest. And we got to discuss your kind of values on what these plants can sustain, and also something that you value as an adult, like a butterfly that's eating your plant that you don't like. You like this plant that's being eaten, so we can go into pests and beneficials. Maybe we need to have a session about that. But yeah, so it's really, I wouldn't say don't. There's no blanket statement about any of this stuff. There's plenty of exotic plants that have tons of pests still that we have. So case by case basis, I would say.
All right, so let me switch over to the be on the lookouts in the disease world. So we'll start off with Entomosporium leaf spot, which I showed already in the previous presentation there, the Indian hawthorn. So that one you can pretty easily recognize by these bright red spots, especially if you see the little blister-like fruiting bodies within there with your hand lens. So then you know you've got Entomosporium leaf spot. Even if just seeing the red spots, you're very high probability that that's what it is. That beyond your, if there are any red tip photinias left out in the landscape, those are severely hit, as well as some of our Indian hawthorns. Sclerotinia stem rot, particularly on the crucifers in the winter vegetable garden, you may see just the decay, or you may see some of the mycelium of the fungus there growing out on certain portions of it. This can also affect certain things in the flower bed, like snapdragons, some other things. Botrytis is another cool season fungus that, as things start to warm up just a little bit more, and we'll be seeing it especially on the flowers, and then getting into the leaves from the flowers of our pansies and violas. Well, I've seen it on pansy, I should say. Camellia petal blight probably going on near a Camellia japonica near you. The blossoms drop off, and we've talked in some other programs about how you would diagnose that. And just to repeat that the test for that is imperfect. You want to pull the base of the flower off and look for a ring of fungal material. So this on the right really speaks to me of Camellia petal blight rather than, let's say, cold injury, the kind of just the blotchiness to it. But the real confirming sign would be in here, seeing some fungal mycelium, a little bit of whiteness there, and it's just starting, so it's kind of hard to see there. So the test is not 100% perfect, but that's what you want to look at to see if you've got Camellia petal blight. Very rarely will you ever see the sign of the fungus as it's producing spores. You've got to get down there in the mulch and look around for it, and there is one of them there. It's called an apothecium, a little kind of mushroom-like structure, very small. That's producing the spores released into the air that then infect the blossoms. Boxwood stem canker and Volutella blight is another thing to be on the lookout for. This particular boxwood here, I don't know which one it had, but likely one of those two. They will cause the death of individual branches, and that is very different from boxwood blight, which will cause leaves to defoliate. So here you see individual branches with yellow leaves that hang on. And we got an inquiry about loropetalum, not because they didn't know what they had, but they thought maybe it was something that should be reported. But we've had this in the state for over a decade now, something like 15 years, and it's something that you can notice with the large black crusty galls on the stems of loropetalum caused by a bacterium. And as far as our rust diseases, now this early part of the very late winter, early spring is when you're going to see the cedar quince rust first come out on the on the eastern red cedar. That is the fungus Gymnosporangium clavipes. So notice just slight swellings. You don't get the big galls like you do with cedar apple rust, but just slight swellings on the branches or needles, and you get then the orange production of the spores, the telia. So far, our cedar apple rust galls are going to be kind of hold up tight until they get those warm rains in maybe April, and we'll start seeing those teleal horns come out. Within the turf grasses, just to mention a couple, spring dead spot, where the infection occurred back in the fall, and because of the infection, the plants did not survive the cold. You get these dead spots in the spring when the turf is starting to green up. And any time of year, you could get fairy ring on any kind of turf species. Finally, another beat on the lookout is for our new extension web page layout starting on March 1st. You're accustomed to us saying at the end of our BOLOs, you can find more of them on our website. That's still going to be true. It's just that the way that you get there, the menu is going to be a little bit different. Starting next week, we'll have this sort of a layout. You can go up to the menu item there and pull them down, but there are also going to be some icons just below the welcome message there that will take you to more Be on the Lookouts month by month if you didn't get your fill here today. And I see that I did not change the date on my BOLOs there. It had last year's PPP date. So sorry about that.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt and Mike. I guess we're ready to move on to our plant these for pollinators. Sounds good. Okay. Well, for those of you that are new this season, or just a reminder that Plant These for Pollinators is a feature we started last year, and the purpose is to highlight great plants for pollinators that are widely adaptable and available that you can add to your landscape to support pollinator health and provide habitat. And just a general tip is to maximize pollinator habitat, you want to have multiple different plants blooming in your landscape throughout the growing season. This can be really important for early spring and then also late in the season when there's just little blooming all around. So those are sometimes known as the dearth periods. So our early season and late season bloomers are especially important. And also a quick reminder before we talk about this month's plant, all of the slides that have been presented for Plant These for Pollinators are available to you as Extension Master Gardener volunteers and Extension professionals to use for Extension programming. And there's a QR code and link here, which will also be included in the resources that go out after the webinar. But today's plant is red maple, Acer rubrum. This is a very common and widespread native tree. It occurs all throughout the eastern United States and Canada. In North Carolina, it's found in every county. It can be found in wet habitats as well as more upland habitats. And in addition to being a really common native tree in the wild, it's a very popular landscape tree, where again, it will grow in a variety of sites, including moist and well-drained sites, as long as it's not extremely dry. So they are going to be happier and more vigorous in moister soils, or say like clay soils, compared to a very sandy site. Would not be the best choice for a red maple. They are shade trees. They can become relatively large, 40 to 70 feet tall and 30 to 50 feet wide. So make sure when you're planting that you plan for that mature size. And one of the reasons they are so popular, probably the biggest reason they're so popular, is their fall color, which can be just gorgeous and can range from reds and scarlets to oranges and yellows. The variety in the picture is October Glory. There are quite a lot of named varieties or cultivars of red maple. So, if you're, and often those have been selected for their fall color or reliability of their fall color. So, if you really want to make sure you have one that's going to give you reliable fall color in a specific color range, the cultivars are helpful there. But in general, it's recommended to try to grow trees that are propagated from seed from your region, because even though this tree has a huge range, as I mentioned, from Canada down to Florida, what you find is those plants from up in Canada are not going to be so happy the further south they move. And then the trees grown from seed collected, say from South Carolina, North Carolina, may not even be winter hardy if you were to try to grow them further north. So try to look to plants that were propagated from your local region. So this is one of the earliest blooming woody plants. And that is very important, as we mentioned, because it provides a reliable early nectar source for pollinators. When it gets warm enough for things like red maple to start blooming, it is warm enough for especially some of our native bees to start foraging. The flowers of red maple, so you might think, well, I've never seen this tree in bloom, and it's because they're really small. So you do have to look for them. Although I will say red maple tree in bloom just has this pinkish haze to it. The flowers are small, but they are in clusters across the whole entire tree. So, you can definitely tell the difference between a tree that's not in bloom and one that's in bloom, because once it gets in bloom, it's just a pinkish red fuzziness to the entire tree. So, and I have our vocabulary word for the day. Red maple trees are what is known as polygam. I know I was going to mess up trying to say this. Polygamidaceous. So you may have heard of plants being monoecious. So there's like one plant is female or dioecious, where you have separate male and female plants. So this is a variation on that, where you can have some trees that are mostly female or primarily female, meaning most of the flowers they produce have just the female reproductive parts. You can have other trees that are mostly male, where most of the flowers they produce just have the male parts. But in most cases, what you're going to find is they're also going to produce some bisexual or what are called perfect flowers that have both male and female parts. So it's not strictly just male or just female trees like you would see in something like hollies. But that can have implications because the female varieties actually tend to have better fall color. And so what you find is most of the named varieties are these mostly female trees. Also, just for resources for pollinators, the male flowers are going to be what produces pollen. And many of our pollinators collect pollen, and that's what they feed their developing young. And the female flowers are what's going to produce nectar. And the nectar is what our pollinators are gathering to give them energy to fuel their flights and activities. And also the female flowers are what produce into the seeds if they are actually pollinated. So these blossoms are opening now. I've seen them in bloom here in the Piedmont area. I'm sure they've probably been in bloom in the coastal plain for a while. I would say the further west you go, they're definitely going to be a little later, but they always do bloom late winter, very early spring before the leaves emerge. So that's why you just get kind of that hazy fuzziness, because the leaves aren't there to obscure them. And they are both wind and insect pollinated. And Matt did a great job already mentioning some of the native pollinators that will take advantage of our red maples. These solitary bees, which are not aggressive, and they nest in aggregates in the soil, as you saw, and Matt had some great pictures, of course. They look a little bit like little anthills, but if you look closely, you'll see the individual bees coming in and out. And as Matt mentioned, they are not aggressive. You should be happy if you have these active on your property. So there's a variety of solitary bees that will take advantage of red maple flowers and gather the nectar and pollen, including the cellophane bees, mining bees, and sweat bees, as well as mason bees if they're out and happen along them. And mason bees are a little different than these ground nesting bees. They will nest in cavities or the dormant stems of plants or dead stems of plants. Also bumblebees We have quite a few native bumblebees across North Carolina, and they will collect nectar from red maple. And they're a little different than these solitary bees. While they're all, native bees, the bumblebees are more colony nesting. So it could be a little more aggressive because they live together more socially, but generally relatively small colonies compared to something like a honeybee. And they're primarily underground, but they will take advantage of other cracks and crevices above ground. And I should mention as well, honeybees will also visit our red maple. Honeybees are not one of our native pollinators, but of course have been introduced for agricultural use. The flowers aren't the only wonderful resource for wildlife. Also, the leaves and seeds feed a wide range of species. The seeds are one of the earliest of our seed-producing native plants to ripen. You'll see them ripening in mid to late spring. They start to develop very soon after the flowers come out. In fact, the seeds are showier than the flowers. They are larger and they can range in color from kind of a pale green, yellowish green to really intense red. And, they again make the tree just kind of look red. You have probably seen them whirl down. They're a seed type called a samara, which has a little wing on it. And children love to call them things like helicopters or whirligigs, throw them up in the air and let them whirl down around them. So these are eaten by birds and small mammals. The leaves, which are relatively trident shaped with either 3 or 5 points, are eaten by a wide range of caterpillars of both butterflies and moths. You can find some really interesting caterpillars on them that will develop into just some of our amazing moth and butterfly species. And, you might be concerned with that many different types of caterpillars potentially feeding on a red maple that, it'll become a problem, but typically the birds help control those caterpillars. So in addition to the seeds feeding the birds, the leaves by feeding caterpillars also feed the birds. And again, Matt did a great job alluding to this. Just a couple things to be aware about red maple when you are deciding to plant one is it is not a tree for parking lots or areas surrounded by impervious surface. All that reflected heat, it creates extra stress on the tree and it boosts the reproduction rate of gloomy scale, which is a major pest of this species when it is planted in those types of sites, in those parking lot sites. Red maple is also not tolerant of higher pH soil, so over 7, which you tend to see that more in urban areas and parking lots. It is poisonous to livestock, specifically horses. So it's not a tree you would want at the edge or in a horse pasture, especially once the leaves are wilted. It can cause issues. And the bark is thin on red maple. That's why it has that very smooth gray bark, especially when it's young. And the thin bark is sensitive to herbicides. So if herbicides are sprayed around, they can be absorbed through the bark, to fire and to physical damage. And, if you are using equipment around it, weed trimmers, and you damage the tree, it's going to cause more damage than something that has a thicker, corkier bark that provides more of a barrier. So ideally, you would plant it somewhere and have a nice mulch ring around it so you're not getting close to it with any type of herbicides or equipment. But in a home landscape or a park or anywhere that has nice open space and soils that are at least relatively moisture retentive, it makes a wonderful shade tree and provides resources for pollinators and other wildlife. So you can learn a lot more about red maple and see more pictures in the plant toolbox. There is an excellent profile for red maple. And we will finish up today with some statewide announcements for the Extension Master Gardener program. And the first one is about a very special webinar we have coming up a month and a day from today for the NC State Day of Giving. It is going to be all about type trees and woody plants that you can plant for bees. We have Dr. Dan Potter, who's an emeritus professor with the University of Kentucky, joining us again. He joined us last year for a special Day of Giving webinar that talked about monarchs, planting milkweed and gardening for monarchs. So he'll be back this year to talk about some research he's been involved in on some of the best trees for bees. So we hope to see you there and encourage you to go ahead and register on the NCEMG intranet. And we are very, very fortunate to once again this year have a challenge gift for the Extension Master Gardener program related to Day of Giving. So a very generous donor has pledged a $10,000 gift to the Extension Master Gardener Endowment if we are able to raise $5,000 in donations to our program fund on Day of Giving, which will be March 26th. You'll be hearing lots more about that coming up, and we just encourage you to consider making a gift on Day of Giving. It helps to fund things like our continuing education webinars and including the Plants, Pests and Pathogens series. And we also ask you to help us spread the word about Day of Giving and this opportunity to support the Extension Master Gardener program through the challenge gift. Starting, next week and throughout March, we'll be posting a lot on the Extension Master Gardener Facebook page, and we really encourage you to share those posts on your local EMG pages or personal Facebook web pages. We recently had a wonderful Learn, Grow, Share showcase. If you missed out just a couple of weeks ago, actually, I think it was last week, it was about growing youth education with 4-H. We had excellent presentations from Master Gardener volunteers in Wake County and Lenoir County, as well as some 4-H professionals about the work they're doing. So I really encourage you to check out that recording and learn and be inspired by the work they're doing with youth in their counties. We want everybody to save the date, and of course you'll be getting lots more information about this in the next few months for our Extension Master Gardener College 2026. We are taking a different approach this year. Instead of being a 3-day conference where everybody has to come to Raleigh and be on campus, we are going out east and west of Raleigh, of campus, and we are doing it as a 1-day workshop that is supported by a webinar series. So we'll have 3 webinars leading up to the workshops. So if you register, you would attend the 3 webinars and then attend one of the workshops. We'll repeat the workshop twice. It'll be held on June 19th in Greenville, North Carolina, or June 26th in Statesville, North Carolina. So you would come to the workshop that's most convenient to you, but still would also attend the webinar series or watch the recordings. So they'll be available as recordings. And we have a single theme. It is Become a Pollinator Ambassador. So all of the webinars and the workshops will be focused on increasing your knowledge of pollinator health and pollinator conservation, best practices for gardening for pollinators to protect them and provide habitat in your home landscape. And we will be opening registration in April. And again, like I said, you'll be hearing a lot more about that, but you're welcome to go to the EMG College website at go.ncsu.edu/EMG-college. And that is where the latest information will be available. Speaking of pollinators, we've got another Save the Date. We want everybody to participate in and even potentially host events for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census. This is a community science project that collects data about pollinator activity across our state and southeastern states that is available to scientists and researchers working on strategies for pollinator conservation. It is August 21st and 22nd, and we have lots of great resources and more information available on the Great Southeast Pollinator Census NC website. We'll include this link in the follow-up resources. And also just shout out to Amanda Bratcher, who is the Extension Horticulture Agent in Lee County, but also the state coordinator for the Southeast Pollinator Census in North Carolina. So we appreciate all the resources she's provided to support our efforts around that. And Amanda has set a goal for all of us across the state this year for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census to exceed 10,000 counts. So have 10,000 people out there counting and have at least one person, if not more, in each of North Carolina's 100 counties to submit their counts this year. So you can be a really important part of helping us reach that goal. There's also an excellent opportunity if you want to boost your knowledge of pollinators that you can sign up for the Great Southeast Pollinator course, which will go in depth about the pollinator groups that are the insect pollinators, I should specify, that we encounter across the Southeast and that you count as part of the census. So there's more information available at the link on the screen, and of course, we'll include that in the follow-up resources too. All of the things we've mentioned will be in our next Extension Master Gardener statewide newsletter, which is coming out next week. It is the Learn, Grow, Share newsletter, so encourage you to keep an eye out for that. Learn about these and other things. There'll be lots of great information. If you've missed a past issue, or if you ever want to go back and see past issues, they are available on the North Carolina Extension Master Gardener intranet. And with that, we'll wrap things up right on 11:30 with a mention of next month. So we look forward to seeing everybody next month. We really appreciate you joining us today for our Plants, Pests, and Pathogens 2026 season launch. Next month, we will have guest speakers, Allison Whitaker and Corey Davis. They are both from the State Climate Office of North Carolina, and they will be talking about growing season scenarios. So what can we expect weather-wise for 2026? And as gardeners, we know that the weather is an extremely important part of plant health and just being able to garden successfully. Look forward to seeing you again next month, and thank you again for being with us today.